Today I'm dishing out a hot take. In both fantasy and sci-fi, interesting countries or nations are just as important as the characters that drive their stories. Fans identify themselves with the country's ideals and bond with them and their fates. As a result, leaving a nation generic and unexplored makes not only your setting feel empty and lifeless, but your entire work more boring. To prevent your work to be boring, I'm giving you 3 prompts to ask yourself whenever you are creating a country in your setting, no matter if you are an author, a dungeon master, or are world building just for fun. The Kingdom of Gondor, the Galactic Republic, and the Lordship of Winterfell project an ideal of honor and righteousness. They fight against a dark, evil threat trying to consume the entire world or galaxy. Yet, during the lengths of their stories, their ideals bring them to their knees as they get destroyed, or are at least at destruction's brink. Which brings us to our first prompt. What are your country's ideals? What is your country's philosophy and ideology? And how are these ideals possibly being subverted? Ideals, or rather a state philosophy, are at the core of every country. Ideology dictates national and foreign policy. It makes and breaks how the country is perceived by the outside world. And it handles the interaction with the country's citizens. At the same time, history has shown that ideology drives conflict, which makes it a perfect concept to revolve a story around. One of the most well-written examples of plot revolving around a country's ideology and its repercussions is the story of Ishgard, the chivalric city-state at the focus during the Heavensward expansion of Final Fantasy XIV. Ishgard is established as the traditional good fantasy kingdom, fighting a gruesome war against the draconic hordes of Nidhogg for 1,000 years. Core to their philosophy is the Dragon Song, an ancient record of the origins of their bloody war, and the betrayal of the dragons against their last king Thordan. Ishgard's ideology suits the ruling class well, as the state is ruled by the Church of Halone, the Archbishop, and the noble houses in absence of a king, who is said to return one day to win the war against the dragons. During the length of the story of Heavensward, more and more of the machinations of Ishgard and the very war itself gets unveiled, turning the Dragon Song and the very foundations of the city-state upside down, while the state's righteousness gets put into question. The story of Ishgard and Heavensward as a whole is just one of many examples of a story where a country's philosophy and its many interpretations and subversions are at the core of it. Your story obviously doesn't have to be about the ideology of your country, but any country in your story needs to at least have ideals to be interesting and something people can connect with. Yet these ideals aren't all. Your country can have the most interesting layers of ideals and philosophy, but if there's nobody to stand by them, they don't really matter. Praising Tolkien almost feels like beating a dead horse at this point, but he did make an excellent job of portraying the two sides of Gondor. The bright and ideal side of Gondor is portrayed by Aragorn, a righteous fighter who dedicates his life to vanquish the evil looming at the literal horizon. The hero who becomes king and who puts the country and its people before himself. Denethor opposes this and represents the current state of Gondor. Denethor was the steward of Gondor who doesn't care about the wealth of the nation, merely about the success of his dynasty. He sends men to their death without care, including the second son he hates. While Aragorn represents the past and future ideal of Gondor as the righteous kingdom with a rule for the benefit of all, Denethor represents the contemporary, century-long downfall of a once proud kingdom, who's at the brink of being consumed by the evil at its doorstep and the corruption from within. So as the second prompt, I'm going to ask you, what are the characters that represent your country the most? Most commonly, this includes their rulers, servants of state, or other figures of authority. These don't have to be a single person, of course, either. The entire Senate would fit as an example for the Galactic Republic, as every single senator serves as a representative cog in the machine. I'd put these characters representing their stories into 3 different categories as further aid for inspiration. The first category is the idealist, who either represents the ideal of the state or follows them more or less zealously. The idealists form the inner core of your country's supporters and best represent what your country is about. These idealists can be the actual ruler of the nation, but they don't necessarily have to be. They are equally as well represented by a loyal diplomat or a prince or general trying to prove his worth. Second, we have the realists, who bend the ideology either to their own need and interpretation or bend them in favor of others. They try to gain influence and power by navigating your country's politics or push themselves through the country's machinery to either reform the country or better it. They usually see the country's flaws and use them to their interests. Lastly, the anti-idealists, for lack of a better word. They either actively oppose the state's ideals while remaining loyal to a certain position, person, or the idea of the state itself, while resenting what it is or has become. Character tropes like the honorable yet way too loyal general are good examples for that. Or these characters can represent the antithesis of the state's ideals in character and nature without necessarily resenting the state itself, as they just want to grill in peace. Rebels and people who are indirectly connected to the state and its philosophy aren't included, however. As well as citizens traveling foreign lands like a trader or mercenary, who can serve as a good exposition dump about the country, as they aren't directly connected to its machinations, but at least know about current events. The characters within these categories are the perfect representation of what your country entails. They provide easy outlets for lore dumps, while their opinions and actions will give you an easy tool to show others what your nation is about. At the same time, they provide easy sources of conflict and the perfect representations of the different interests within one country, once there happens to be a power vacuum of any kind. Reminder, if the ruler dies, the machinations of the state don't automatically die with him. So don't end your stories the moment you brought the evil king to his knees. There's one missing part to make a truly interesting country, however. The glue that holds the ideals of your country and the characters that uphold or oppose them together. A way to test your country's limits. The Galactic Republic was riddled with corruption. The galaxy suffered more crime than chances to quell it. Corporations did whatever they pleased and the different star systems were neglected in favor of the rich and powerful core. Crisis after crisis led to the inevitable creation of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, a separatist movement united in their struggle against the central government in the core regions. A horrible war ensued that brought the ideals of the Republic to its test. Idealists like the Jedi fought against the outside threats of the CIS, while staying loyal to the Republic that is betraying more of its ideals the longer the war goes on. You know what followed, after Liberty died with thundering applause. While the Star Wars prequels were far from perfect, their politics are probably their most underrated and my favorite part. The political storyline had the conflict and crisis a good story needs, as it showed the decline of a corrupt and broken republic into the fascism of the Galactic Empire. It pitted the state's idealists against its realists and anti-idealists, while simultaneously facing outside and inside threats, and most importantly, it tested how much the characters and machinations of the state themselves were able to defend both philosophy and ideals and the Republic itself. This leads us to my final prompt. What are the problems and crises your country faces? Times of conflict show how much people are willing to uphold a country's ideology and how easy it is to exploit for personal gain. It puts the characters who are working the best to keep everything running to their limits, while those who exploit it have the time of their life. Of course, these issues don't have to be as fundamental as what happened at the end of the Galactic Republic, but even in the most peaceful of times, a country faces constant struggles and conflict. The difference is that it has the right people willing to work in its favor. And should the country suddenly change its ideology and ideals due to any means, the sudden change in dynamics again creates conflict, as the characters' roles reverse and the idealists become the anti-idealists. If you want to go further in depth and want to create a feudal kingdom, for example, watch this video. Otherwise, I'd recommend you to watch my previous videos, as they all help you to improve your world building.